"I will have your baby," she said, her voice trembling not with fear but with a strange determination that made the night air thicken around them. The lantern light in the ranch house window flickered like a weak heart, and the prairie stretched in silence, as if the world itself leaned in to hear what she had declared. The rancher stood still, his broad shoulders blocking the doorway, his hands scarred from years of labor, his eyes shadowed by memories no one dared to ask about. He looked at her with the weight of storms long buried, and though no word escaped his mouth, something in his silence was louder than thunder. She stepped closer, her frail hands clutching the fabric of her dress, eyes burning with a fire she didn't know she had carried until that very moment. Life had been cruel to her, and she had walked through valleys of hunger, betrayal, and abandonment, but here she stood, giving voice to the only thing that felt alive inside her: hope. Hope wrapped in the form of a child yet unborn, hope tied to this man who stood like a mountain before her. The rancher's jaw tightened. He had buried promises before, in shallow graves under oak trees and along dry riverbeds where no one lingered. He knew the weight of a vow too heavy to carry, and in her words he heard chains clinking, shackles binding him to a life he had run from. He turned his back to her, walking into the room where shadows swallowed him whole, but she followed, whispering again, "I will have your baby." Her words weren't soft anymore. They cracked like a whip in the stillness, tearing at his guarded silence. He gripped the edge of the wooden table, the veins in his forearms rising as though the very blood inside him wanted to escape. A memory rose, the face of another woman, years ago, who had spoken promises in the same trembling tone, promises that ended in blood on the floorboards, in silence too thick to breathe. The woman didn't know this story, didn't know the scars behind his eyes, but she saw the storm rising in him. Fear should have made her run, but she stood her ground, pressing forward with the courage of one who has nothing left to lose. "You can run from the world," she said, "but you cannot run from what God places in your path. I am here, and I am not leaving." The rancher's chest rose and fell, his breathing heavy as though the air itself fought against him. The room smelled of wood smoke and dust, but underneath it lingered the iron scent of rage, of battles fought not with fists but with secrets and regrets. He turned slowly, his eyes no longer human but storm clouds ready to break. Her heart thudded, yet she didn't step back. "You think you're cursed," she whispered, her voice shaking but steady in meaning. "But I will have your child, and through that life, you will be redeemed." Something broke inside him then, not in peace but in fury. His hand reached for the iron at his side, the cold weight that had solved too many of his torments before. The revolver gleamed faintly in the lantern light, a serpent ready to strike. She saw it, but her eyes did not waver. "Do it, if you must," she said softly. "But even if you take my life, my words will live in you. You can kill me, but you cannot kill what I have spoken." The silence after her words was a canyon, deep and echoing. His hand shook as he raised the weapon, every muscle torn between rage and something he dared not name. She stood before him, frail but unyielding, her eyes like two small flames daring the darkness to consume her. The shot shattered the night. Outside, the horses stirred in their stalls, and the wind carried the sound across the barren land like a prayer ripped apart. Inside, smoke curled in the air, mingling with the lantern glow, and the weight of what had been. Dun pressed down like the sky itself had collapsed. She crumpled slowly, not with a scream, but with a sigh that seemed to forgive him even as the blood spread across the floor. Her eyes stayed on him until they dimmed, and in that fading gaze he saw not accusation but something far worse, mercy. The revolver slipped from his hand, striking the wooden floor with a hollow sound. He staggered backward, clutching at the table as though it alone could hold him upright. The silence that followed was unbearable, louder than any storm, sharper than any blade. He fell to his knees beside her, shaking, his hands reaching for a life already slipping away. Her final words lingered in the air, burning into his mind, searing his soul, "I will have your baby." And though her body grew cold, those words did not die. They lived in him, haunting him, binding him, reminding him with every breath that no bullet could silence destiny. The rancher bowed his head, his heart crushed under the weight of what he had done, and in the stillness of that desolate house, he knew that her voice would never leave him. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in his ears long after the smoke had drifted upward and thinned into nothing. The rancher sat in silence, his chest rising and falling like a man who had carried the weight of mountains and then found they had all collapsed upon him. His calloused hand hovered over her still body, trembling as though afraid to touch what he had destroyed. The lantern flickered once more, throwing restless shadows across the wooden floor, and in those shadows he saw images that would never leave him. The fire in her eyes when she spoke, the way her lips had shaped words that cut deeper than any blade, the way her body had folded into the earth as though it had always been destined to lie there. He tried to stand, but his knees betrayed him. He had faced storms that stripped trees bare, rivers swollen with death, and men whose eyes held no mercy, yet none of that had broken him as this woman had. She had not lifted a hand against him, had not cursed him, had not begged. Instead, she had spoken hope into a man who had forgotten what hope was, and that, more than the bullet, was what tore him apart. He pressed his palms to his face, feeling the grit of sweat and dust mixed with tears he didn't realize he shed. His breath came ragged, like a man drowning in air, and his heart pounded as though it wanted to break free from the prison of his chest. For years he had built walls around himself, walls of silence and violence, of solitude and suspicion. He had thought himself safe behind them, untouchable, unreachable. But she had walked through those walls as though they were nothing, and with one sentence she had undone everything he thought he was. The words came back again, soft but sharp, filling the hollow of the room. "I will have your baby." He heard them not only in his mind but in the way the wind rattled the shutters, in the creak of the wooden boards, in the restless stirring of the horses outside. It was as though the earth itself had recorded her vow and repeated it to him, a chorus he could not silence. He dragged himself upright, staring down at her. Her hair lay across her cheek like strands of night, her lips slightly parted, her chest unmoving. He had seen death before, but never like this. Death had always been faceless, an enemy he could fight or a foe he could forget. But now it lay before him in a woman who had spoken of life, and he realized too late that what he had killed was more than flesh. He had killed the only promise of redemption that had ever come near him. A storm began to gather outside. The wind picked up, whipping against the walls of the ranch house, and distant thunder rumbled like the voice of judgment. The rancher clenched his fists, his jaw tight, and for a moment he thought the sky itself had turned against him. He lifted her in his arms, her body lighter than he expected, as if she had already drifted into the weightless realm beyond. He carried her out into the night, his boots sinking into the wet soil as the first drops of rain fell. He walked toward the field where wildflowers once grew in spring, now reduced to stalks bent low by the coming storm. There, beneath a solitary oak whose branches had weathered more seasons than he could count, he laid her down. He dug with his bare hands at first, scooping mud and earth until his fingers bled, then fetched the old shovel from the shed. Each thrust into the soil was an act of penance, each mound of dirt thrown aside a confession unspoken. He worked until his back ached and the rain plastered his hair to his forehead, until the hole yawned open like the grave he had dug for himself long ago. He lowered her gently, wrapping her in the faded quilt that had once belonged to his mother. The fabric, though worn and frayed, carried warmth and memory, as if it could shield her from the cold of eternity. He knelt at the edge, staring into the pit that swallowed her, and whispered words he never thought he'd speak. "Forgive me." His voice cracked, breaking apart like dry wood. He said it again, louder this time, his tears mixing with the rain. "Forgive me." But the only reply was thunder, rolling across the heavens. He covered her slowly, each shovelful of dirt landing with a dull thud that echoed in his bones. The rain softened the earth, making it cling to his hands and boots, but he did not stop until the mound rose, marking the place where she now slept. He sank to his knees before it, his forehead pressed to the wet soil, and for the first time in years, he prayed. Not for himself, for he believed no prayer could save him, but for her, for the child she had spoken of, for the words she had left behind. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, but the world was not lighter. The air smelled of damp earth and sorrow, and the sky stretched pale and cold above him. He rose slowly, his body stiff, his heart heavier than the stones around the field. He walked back to the ranch house, each step dragging as though chains bound him to the ground. Inside, the silence was unbearable. Her voice still lingered, but now it twisted in his ears like a curse and a blessing intertwined. He poured himself a drink, but the whiskey burned without comfort. He threw the glass against the wall, watching it shatter into shards that caught the light. His reflection in the window stared back at him, a stranger with hollow eyes. He pressed his fist against the glass until it cracked, and still the words echoed, "I will have your baby." Days turned into weeks, and yet he could not escape her. The ranch became a prison, each corner filled with her absence, each night haunted by her voice. He saw her in dreams, standing in the doorway with the same fire in her eyes, whispering the same vow. Sometimes she held a child in her arms, its face hidden, its cry piercing through his sleep. He would wake drenched in sweat, his hand reaching for the revolver, only to find himself grasping emptiness. He began to wander the fields at night, drawn to the oak where he had buried her. He would sit by the mound, speaking words he had never spoken to anyone, confessing secrets long buried, regrets he had never admitted. He told her of the battles he had fought, of the men he had killed, of the love he once knew and lost. He spoke of his fear, of the darkness that lived in him, of the curse he believed he carried. And always, he ended with the same whisper, "Forgive me." But forgiveness never came. The wind carried his words away, the stars stared down without mercy, and the earth remained silent. Yet he kept returning, night after night, as though bound by an unseen tether. One evening, under the pale light of the moon, he thought he heard something, a faint sound, like a heartbeat beneath the soil. He pressed his ear to the mound, his breath held, and for a moment he swore he felt life pulsing there. His heart raced, and he staggered back, shaken. The words returned stronger than ever, echoing through his mind, through his very blood, "I will have your baby." From that night on, he was never the same. He worked the ranch by day, but his eyes always drifted toward the oak, toward the grave that called to him. He began to believe her vow was not broken by death, that somehow, in ways he could not understand, her words were living, growing, waiting. Men who came to trade cattle noticed the change in him. They whispered among themselves that the rancher had gone mad, that he spoke to shadows, that his eyes carried a haunted fire. Some said the land itself was cursed, that the storm that night had left more than rain behind. Others avoided him altogether, sensing the weight of something unearthly in his presence. But he did not care for their whispers. His world had narrowed to the grave, to the vow, to the haunting. He found himself carving small wooden figures late at night, shaping them into cradles, into toys, into the likeness of a child he had never seen. He placed them by the mound, offerings to the silence, gifts to the promise he could not forget. As the seasons turned, his hair grew gray, his body slower, but the fire of her words never dimmed. They drove him, consumed him, defined him. He had thought himself free when the bullet struck, but instead he found himself bound more tightly than ever. Death had not ended her hold on him, it had sealed it for eternity. And so the rancher lived, not as the man he once was, but as a shadow of her vow, haunted by the voice of a woman who had dared to speak life into his darkness, a woman he could not silence even with a gun. The land bore witness, the oak stood sentinel, and the words remained carved into his very soul, echoing through every step he took, every breath he drew. "I will have your baby." The rancher moved through his days as though each one were an echo of the last, the sound of her voice following him like a shadow too close to outrun. Seasons folded into each other, and though the land yielded cattle, grass, and storms as it always had, he himself grew leaner, more haunted, like a man carved down to bone by memory. The grave beneath the oak became the center of his life, and every morning before the sun crept over the horizon, he walked to it, hat in hand, boots sinking in the dew-soaked earth. He stood there as though expecting her to rise, as though the soil itself might split and return to him what he had taken away. He spoke to her as if she lived still. Sometimes his voice was a whisper, choked and trembling, and other times it thundered across the fields with the fury of a storm. He told her of the nights that stretched too long, of the whiskey that no longer burned enough to numb him, of the silence that mocked him in every corner of the ranch house. He confessed dreams he could not escape, dreams where he saw her standing in the moonlight with a child in her arms. He would wake with the image of the infant's eyes staring back at him, eyes that belonged to both of them, and the emptiness that followed was worse than any wound he had ever suffered. At times he thought the grave breathed. The earth shifted, grass swayed without wind, and the oak above it groaned as though carrying the weight of a secret. Once, in the dead of night, he swore he heard a cry from beneath. The soil, faint as the rustle of leaves, but sharp enough to cut through his soul. He dug with frantic hands, clawing at the dirt until his nails split and bled, only to find stillness beneath. He collapsed there, chest heaving, his face pressed to the earth, and sobbed like a man undone. The rancher's neighbors avoided him. Men who had once traded with him now rode past in silence, tipping their hats without stopping. Rumors spread in the nearby town of a man cursed, a man who spoke to the dead, a man whose eyes carried a wildness that made horses shy away. Children whispered about the oak tree on his land, saying that if you stood beneath it at night, you could hear a woman's voice, soft and steady, repeating the same vow. Few dared test it. Loneliness pressed on him, but he did not resist it. He welcomed it, as if punishment were the only companion he deserved. Yet sometimes, when the moon cast silver light across the plains, he imagined her hand in his, imagined her laughter in the house, imagined a child's footsteps running across the wooden floors. These visions burned him more than fire, for they showed him what could have been if his hand had not reached for the revolver into storms, and it was not long before men with greed in their hearts and fear in their veins began to listen again. One late summer evening, as the sky burned with streaks of crimson, Eliza ventured into town with Elias wrapped against her chest. She sought flour, salt, needles, simple things for survival. Yet the stares that met her cut deeper than before. Women glanced and quickly turned away, men sneered, and whispers followed her like shadows. She walked with head high, her grip on her son firm, her spirit refusing to bend. But she saw in their eyes a growing resentment, a seed Brig had planted and which now took root. When she returned to Calder and told him what she had felt, his jaw clenched, his silence heavier than stone. He had always carried himself with the strength of solitude, but now he carried the weight of protecting two souls who meant more to him than his own breath. He looked at Elias, then at Eliza, and vowed in his heart that no man's hatred would ever tear them from him. The seasons turned, and Elias grew into a boy with his father's strength in his bones and his mother's fire in his eyes. By the time he could walk, he followed Calder through the woods, his small steps determined, his laughter echoing among the trees. Calder showed him how to recognize the print of deer hooves in mud, how to listen for the call of an eagle, how to find berries that would not poison the tongue. Eliza watched them from the cabin porch, her heart a river overflowing with pride. Yet danger did not sleep. Brig's bitterness had become obsession, and obsession turns to violence when fed long enough. He gathered men not from the town itself, but drifters and outlaws, promising them spoils if they would help him rid the mountains of Calder Holt. They came not for justice, but for greed, and one autumn night, when the wind was sharp and the moon hung pale, they set out toward Granite Hollow with rifles and torches. Eliza sensed it first. The night felt wrong, the air too heavy, the silence too still. Calder, sharpening his axe by the fire, looked up when she placed her hand on his shoulder. He met her eyes, and without words, he knew. He rose, took his rifle, and kissed his son's head before stepping out into the cold. Eliza followed, Elias clinging to her skirts. The glow of torches appeared through the trees, and the sound of horses carried across the ridge. Calder stood tall before the cabin, his shadow cast long by the fire within. The men approached, their leader's face twisted by years of spite and scars of pride. Brig raised his good hand and shouted into the night, accusing Calder of crimes long past, calling him murderer, devil, beast unfit to raise a child. His words dripped venom, but Calder did not flinch. Eliza stepped forward, Elias at her side, and her voice cut through Brig's curses. You came once before with fire and lies, and you failed. You come again, but you will fail again, for this house is built not on fear but on love, and no weapon forged of hate can break it. Her words stirred the air, and for a moment, some men faltered, their eyes shifting with doubt. But greed is a cruel master, and Brig's hatred was wildfire. He ordered them to strike. Rifles lifted, torches swung forward, and the night erupted. Calder moved with the fury of a storm unleashed. He fired his rifle with precision, driving men back. When bullets ran low, his axe became an extension of his arm, cleaving through the chaos with the raw power of survival. Eliza, fierce as the mountain itself, took Elias into the cabin and laid him beneath the bed, whispering for him not to fear. She returned with the second rifle, firing with steady hands, her aim sharpened by a mother's will to protect. The battle raged like thunder, but the mountain seemed to fight with them. Horses reared and scattered as if sensing the fury of nature itself, and men who came with laughter fled with screams. Brigg fought harder, driven by rage alone, but even he began to falter when Calder closed in, their eyes meeting in a final clash of wills. "You call me beast," Calder growled, "but it is you who came with fire to destroy what you could never understand." With a final blow, he cast Brigg down, broken in body and spirit. His men scattered into the darkness. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the crackle of torches dying in the snow. Calder stood heaving, his chest rising like the bellows of a forge, and Eliza rushed to his side, her eyes wide with both relief and awe. Elias crawled from his hiding place, running into his father's arms, and in that embrace, the storm ended. The next day, word spread through the town of Brigg's defeat. Some shook their heads, some muttered curses, but others began to see the truth. Whispers changed, and slowly, the story of the beast began to shift. No longer was Calder Holt spoken only of in fear, but in respect. They said he was a man who fought not for pride, not for blood, but for his family, and in that truth, fear began to die. Years passed, and Elias grew tall and strong, his laughter a song that echoed through the mountains. Calder and Eliza aged, their love deepening like roots sinking into soil, unshaken by storm or fire. The cabin grew into a homestead, fields tilled, animals raised, and though they remained apart from the town, they were no longer its outcasts. Traders came with fair deals, neighbors spoke with courtesy, and slowly, the story of the caged mountain man turned into legend, not of a beast, but of a man redeemed by the courage of a woman who once whispered, "Please marry me." But legends do not come without sacrifice, and the mountains never stop testing those who belong to them. Calder's scars remained, not only on his body but on his soul. Eliza carried them with him, not as burdens, but as proof of battles fought and won. Together they faced sickness, hunger, storms, and the long winters that stretched like eternity. Yet each time the fire burned low, their love kindled it again. And Elias, growing into a man, carried within him the fire of both his parents. He had his father's strength, his mother's faith, and the mountain's wild spirit. He listened to their stories, learned their scars, and built his life upon the unshakable truth that love can redeem even the most broken of men. Thus the years etched their tale not only into memory but into the very stone of Granite Hollow, where the wind still whispers of a woman who begged a feared mountain man to marry her, and of how love turned cages into sanctuaries, beasts into fathers, and despair into a fire that no storm could ever extinguish. The ranch house stood silent after his death, its walls heavy with the weight of voices that never seemed to leave. The windows looked out over the plains like empty eyes, and the wind that whistled through the cracks carried more than just the chill of the seasons, it carried whispers. Those who passed by claimed they could hear her words on the breeze, words that had become more than a vow, more than a memory. They had become part of the land itself. Children who dared each other to approach at night returned wide-eyed, saying they had heard a woman's voice calling softly, tenderly, repeating again and again, "I will have your baby." But the ranch did not remain abandoned for long. A drifter came one autumn, a young man with eyes dark as the river's depths and hands roughened by a life already too hard for his age. He had no family, no name worth speaking, and no reason to stop except for the way the ranch seemed to pull him in. The oak tree caught his attention first. It stood taller than he had ever seen, its branches stretching wide, its roots thick and ancient. Beneath it, he felt something stirring, something that pressed against his chest and made him linger. He found the house weathered but still standing strong. Dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs hung from the rafters, but it was the small things that held him captive. Wooden cradles leaned against the walls, hand-carved toys lay scattered across shelves, and little boots sat neatly by the hearth as though waiting for a child who had simply gone to bed. The man stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, his heart pounding in his ears. He did not know the history, did not know of the vow or the grave, yet he felt as though he had stepped into a place thick with unseen presence. He stayed that night, lying on the floor beside the cold fireplace. The wind rattled the shutters, and the silence pressed in heavy, but then he heard it, soft, steady, undeniable. A woman's voice, low and clear, whispered from the dark. "I will have your baby." He sat up, his breath catching, but there was no one in sight. The voice came again, closer this time, warm like a breath against his ear. He pressed his hands to his face, trembling, yet something inside him did not fear. Something inside him answered, though he did not understand why. In the days that followed, the drifter remained. He mended the fences, cleared the dust from the house, and tended to the cattle that had survived the years of neglect. The work gave his hands purpose, but it was the unseen presence that gave his heart direction. At night he returned to the oak, drawn to the mound at its base. He did not know who rested there, but he spoke to it anyway, telling the earth of his wanderings, of his hunger, of his loneliness. Each time he finished, he thought he felt a reply, not in words, but in warmth that lingered, in wind that brushed his face like a gentle hand. The neighbors noticed the return of life to the ranch. Smoke rose from the chimney again, the fields were being worked, and cattle roamed with more care than they had in years. But they also whispered. They said the drifter spoke to no one, that he had eyes too haunted for a young man, and that at night, strange sounds carried from the land. Laughter, footsteps, a woman's voice singing lullabies to no child in sight. Some called it cursed, others called it holy, but none dared come too close. Winter came hard that year, snow piling high against the fences, wind tearing across the plains with merciless force. The drifter fought to keep the animals alive, but each night he felt the same presence near him, guiding him, steadying him. One night, as he lay half asleep by the fire, he dreamed, or thought he dreamed, of a woman standing at the foot of his bed. She wore a dress that shimmered like moonlight, her hair flowing like rivers of night, and in her arms she held a child. She looked at him with eyes that pierced deep into his soul, and she whispered the words he had come to know so well, "I will have your baby." When he woke, tears clung to his cheeks, and the quilt that had been folded on the shelf now covered him though he had not touched it. He sat up, clutching the fabric, and whispered into the empty room, "Then let it be so." From that moment, his life changed. He began to prepare as though for something unseen. He built a cradle sturdier than the others, polished until it gleamed in the light. He mended the little boots left behind, setting them neatly at the hearth. He even carved a rocking chair, smoothing the edges until his hands ached. To anyone else, he looked like a man lost in madness, but to him it was obedience. And then came spring. The snow melted, the grass pushed through the earth, and the oak stretched greener than ever before. One morning, as he stood by the mound beneath it, he felt a stirring in his chest, stronger than any he had known. The wind brushed past him, warm and fragrant, and he heard the voice again, clearer, closer, undeniable. Life will come, even through death. He fell to his knees, pressing his hands to the soil, and for the first time he spoke back without fear. "Then let it come through me." Word spread quietly in the nearby town of the drifter who had taken over the cursed ranch. Some said he had gone mad, that he spoke to ghosts, that the land itself had claimed him. Others said they saw him change. His eyes no longer hollow, his posture no longer bent by weariness, but a fire in him that could not be explained. The whispers grew when a young woman from the town began to visit. She was plain in face but bright in spirit, a woman who carried baskets of food to the ranch and lingered longer each time she came. The drifter, who had once spoken to no one, now sat with her by the fire, his voice low but steady, his eyes soft where once they had been sharp. The neighbors watched with unease, for they knew the stories of the vow, of the woman long buried, of the rancher who had gone to his grave haunted by her words. Yet as the months passed, the unease gave way to awe. For when the young woman began to swell with child, the whispers grew louder. Some said it was fate, others said it was the curse fulfilled. But the drifter himself knew it for what it was, the vow alive, breathing through him, carried forward into flesh and blood. He held her hand beneath the oak tree, his other hand pressed to the mound, and whispered into the soil, "It is happening. Your words were true. Life has come." And though no one else heard it, he swore the earth answered back with the sound of a woman's laughter, soft and sure, carried by the wind. The ranch house, once filled only with ghosts and echoes, became filled with new sounds, laughter, footsteps, the cries of a newborn child. The wooden toys that had gathered dust were touched by small hands, the cradle rocked with life at last, and the boots by the hearth found new feet to wear them. The drifter sat by the fire each night, holding the child in his arms, whispering promises he never thought he would make. And when he looked into the child's eyes, he saw not only his own reflection but something greater, the fire of a vow too strong to die, too pure to be silenced. The neighbors no longer spoke of curses. They spoke of miracles, of promises kept beyond the grave, of a love so fierce it bent the course of destiny itself. And beneath the oak, the mound rested undisturbed, covered in flowers that seemed to bloom brighter each year, as if watered by something more eternal than rain. But the vow did not end there. It lived in the child, in every laugh, in every step, in every breath. It lived in the drifter who had become more than a wanderer. It lived in the ranch house that now echoed with life. And it lived in the wind, in the soil, in the oak whose roots dug deep into the earth, carrying with them the words that had reshaped everything. I will have your baby. The child grew quickly, as though time itself had bent to fulfill the vow more urgently than nature intended. His cries once pierced the silence of the ranch house, but soon they gave way to laughter, to stumbling footsteps across the wooden floorboards, to the sound of tiny hands knocking over the toys carved long before his birth. The drifter, who no longer looked like a drifter but a man planted firmly in the soil of destiny, watched every movement with a mixture of awe and fear. He had wandered the world without purpose, but now purpose lived in his arms, stared up at him with eyes that seemed too knowing for their age. The young mother, whose spirit had brought warmth back to the home, often whispered that the boy did not belong only to them. She would sit in the rocking chair with him pressed to her chest and say, "He carries something more. Can't you feel it? When he looks at me, it's like he's listening to voices I can't hear." The drifter would nod silently, his jaw tightening, because he too had felt it, though he dared not speak it aloud. As the boy grew older, he wandered often toward the oak tree. Before he could even form full sentences, he toddled across the fields with surprising determination, his small hands reaching for the rough bark. Sometimes he would press his ear against the trunk and giggle as though the tree had told him a secret. Other times he would sit by the mound beneath it, babbling softly in a language only he seemed to understand. The drifter and his wife watched from a distance, unease mingling with wonder, for they both knew the history of that place, the vow that had birthed their son into existence. When he was 5, he startled them both one evening by saying, "Mama was here before." His mother frowned, brushing his hair back. "What do you mean, little one?" The boy looked at her with eyes as steady as the horizon. "The other mama. She told me I belonged to her too." The words chilled the room, and though the fire burned hot, the drifter felt a coldness creep into his bones. He wanted to correct the child, to tell him it was just imagination, but he could not. Deep within, he knew it was truth. The neighbors began to notice the boy as well. He was quiet, but when he spoke, his words carried a weight that silenced grown men. Once, when a storm threatened to ruin the harvest, the boy walked to the edge of the field, lifted his face to the sky, and whispered something no one could hear. The storm clouds broke apart that very hour, rain falling gently instead of violently, leaving the crops standing tall. Word spread quickly, and people began to say the child was touched, that he was proof the land itself carried a blessing wrapped in mystery. But not all whispers were kind. Some said the ranch was still cursed, that the boy was born of a vow made in blood, and that such promises never ended without a price. Mothers pulled their children closer when he passed, and old men muttered prayers under their breath. The drifter heard these whispers and fought to protect his son, but even he could not deny the strangeness that followed them. By the time the boy turned 10, he had begun to dream vividly. He told his parents of a woman with dark hair who came to him at night, holding his hand and guiding him through fields of light. "She tells me stories," he would say with a soft smile, "about the man who was afraid, about how he didn't believe, and about how love is stronger than fear." His mother would weep quietly when he spoke these words, while his father's heart would twist painfully, for he recognized the woman from the fragments of his own dreams. The boy's bond with the oak deepened. He began to carve wooden figures like his father, though his small hands shaped them with startling precision. One day, he placed a carving of a woman holding a child at the base of the tree. "This is her," he said simply. "She asked me to make it." His father's throat tightened as he lifted the figure, the grain of the wood warm beneath his hands as though it pulsed with life. Years passed, and the boy became a young man. Strong, steady, and quiet, he carried an aura that drew people to him. Neighbors who once whispered curses now sought his counsel, traveling miles to hear his words, though he never claimed wisdom for himself. He would sit beneath the oak and listen, his head tilted slightly as though hearing something others could not, and then he would speak, and his words seemed to heal wounds deeper than flesh. The drifter, now older and grayer, watched with both pride and unease. He knew this was no ordinary son. He knew the vow had lived through him and now flowed through his child, shaping a destiny that neither he nor his wife could control. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was still, he would walk to the oak and kneel by the mound, whispering, "Is this what you meant? Is this the child you spoke of? Did I only borrow him from you?" And though no voice answered, he always left with the sense that he had been heard. One summer, when the boy was nearly grown, tragedy struck the town nearby. A sickness spread, felling strong men and children alike, leaving families in despair. Fear thickened the air, and hope withered. Desperate, the townsfolk turned to the boy. They gathered at the ranch, pleading for help, believing the whispers of miracles tied to his name. He stood before them, his eyes calm, his voice steady. "I cannot cure with my hands," he said, "but I will sit beneath the oak, and I will ask." That evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, he sat by the mound beneath the tree. His father watched from a distance, his heart pounding, his wife clutching his arm. The boy bowed his head, his lips moving in prayer, and for hours he did not rise. When he finally stood, a wind swept through the fields, carrying with it the fragrance of blossoms though no flowers bloomed. That night, the sickness broke. By dawn, the fever had lifted from the town, and families wept with relief. The vow had lived. It had not only brought life into the world but carried life to others. The legend of the boy spread beyond the plains, drawing strangers from faraway places. They came seeking healing, wisdom, hope, and they found it in him, the child of two mothers, the one who bore him in flesh and the one whose vow had birthed him through death. But destiny carries both blessing and burden. The boy, though filled with light, carried shadows too. He often walked alone to the oak, speaking softly to the unseen, his shoulders heavy with what only he knew. Once, when his father asked what troubled him, he replied, "Her vow was not just for me. It was for all who will come. And it will never end." The drifter's heart ached at those words, for he understood them in a way that tore him apart. The vow had begun long before him and would outlive even his son. It was eternal, stretching beyond time, weaving itself into the land, into the people, into the generations to come. He realized then that he had not simply found a home on the ranch. He had stepped into a story far greater than himself, a story written in blood, in mercy, in unbreakable words. And as he looked upon his son, standing tall beneath the oak, framed by the endless horizon, he knew the vow had become flesh not once, but in every heartbeat, in every voice, in every soul that believed. It was no longer a whisper. It was a living song, carried forever by the wind. "I will have your baby." The boy grew into a man, and the man grew into something more than flesh and bone. His very presence became a pillar for the land around him. People spoke of him not as the son of a drifter or the heir of a ranch but as if he were a bridge between heaven and earth. Yet he himself carried the simplicity of one who worked the soil, who rose before dawn to tend cattle, who mended fences, who still sat at the table with his parents, bowing his head in gratitude before every meal. His mother aged with grace, though her eyes held the quiet knowledge that her son was destined for a life larger than their ranch. The drifter, gray-haired now, still wrestled with the weight of what had begun under that oak. He was proud of his son, yet he feared the vow that had given him life. For vows made in blood are never easily finished, and he wondered always whether a day would come when it demanded payment again. It was during the winter of his 21st year that the weight of destiny began to press harder. The man had been walking into town more often, not to trade or to buy, but to meet with those who gathered around him. They asked questions that others could not answer, questions of life, of loss, of why the earth gave and why it sometimes took away. He answered not as one who had studied books but as one who had listened to the eternal whisper. His words healed hearts, and for a time, that was enough. But peace seldom lasts. There were those in town who grew uneasy with his influence. A sheriff with sharp eyes and a preacher who felt his own pulpit grow emptier each week began to mutter that this rancher's son was stirring false hopes. "No man should carry words like those unless he is sent by God himself," the preacher said, bitterness in his voice. The sheriff, more practical, feared the boy's growing following would weaken his own authority. Men of power always see threats where others see hope. One night, as frost covered the earth and the stars glistened coldly overhead, the drifter found his son beneath the oak. He was kneeling by the mound again, his breath forming small clouds in the air. The old man approached, his joints aching, his heart heavy. "Son," he said softly, "you are walking a path I cannot follow. I feel it in my bones. But I need to know, what end do you see?" The young man raised his head, his eyes carrying a light that both comforted and unsettled. "The vow was never for me alone," he said. "It was for the broken, for the lost, for those who will come long after I am gone. But every vow has a cost, Father. And the cost is close." The drifter's chest tightened. He had feared those words for years, but to hear them spoken aloud shattered him. He wanted to take his son away, to flee to some distant place where destiny could not find. Yet he knew better. You cannot outrun a vow sealed beneath the earth and rooted in eternity. Not long after, strangers began to arrive. They came from distant towns, drawn by stories of a man who healed without touch, who spoke words that carried the weight of heaven. They brought their sick, their lame, their broken-hearted. Many returned home whole. The oak became a gathering place, its branches sheltering the weary, its mound a silent altar of remembrance. The ranch was no longer just a home, it was a beacon. But the sheriff watched with anger. He saw law bending before something greater, and it gnawed at him. The preacher's jealousy festered until his sermons dripped with warnings of false prophets. Together, they conspired, whispering that the boy was dangerous, that he stirred rebellion, that he must be silenced before he turned the people against their rightful leaders. One spring evening, as dusk bled into night, the sheriff rode hard to the ranch with armed men. They came with torches, their faces set with grim determination. The young man did not resist when they bound his hands. His father, desperate, tried to fight them, but the butt of a rifle drove him to the ground. "Let him go," the drifter cried, blood on his lips. But the sheriff only sneered. "We'll let him go when the people see him for what he is." They dragged the young man to town, locking him in a barn as though he were no more than a thief. Word spread swiftly, and by dawn, the townsfolk gathered, torn between fear and loyalty. The preacher shouted that the boy was deceiving them, that only judgment awaited those who followed him. The sheriff declared that law must prevail. Yet the people hesitated, for their hearts had been touched by the very life he carried. The young man stood before them, bound yet unbroken. His voice, calm as ever, rose above the clamor. "You fear what you cannot understand," he said. "But love cannot be bound. Truth cannot be silenced. This vow is not mine, nor my father's, nor my mother's. It belongs to the one who gave it, and it will live on, even if I do not." His words shook the crowd. Some wept, others turned away, but the sheriff, hard as stone, raised his pistol. "Enough," he growled. "This ends now." The drifter broke through the crowd, falling to his knees before the sheriff. "Take me instead," he begged. "He is only a boy. Take my life for his." But the young man shook his head, his voice firm. "No, Father, this is the price." And so it was that beneath the weight of fear and the crack of gunfire, the vow was sealed again in blood. The young man fell, his body crumpling to the earth, yet his eyes never lost their light. Even as life left him, he whispered words that those closest heard and never forgot. "It is finished, but it begins again." The crowd fell silent. The sheriff lowered his smoking pistol, but victory did not rest on his shoulders. For in that moment, the air itself seemed to shift. The oak, standing miles away on the ranch, trembled as though struck by wind, though the night was still. Its branches bent low, its roots groaned, and from the mound beneath it came a fragrance like blossoms in spring. Those who had stood near the tree swore later that they heard a voice in the rustling leaves. "I will have your baby, and your baby's baby, until love fills the earth." The drifter collapsed beside his son, his cries raw and unbroken. The mother, her face wet with tears, knelt with him. They held the lifeless body between them, but even as grief tore them apart, a strange peace filled the night. For though flesh had fallen, the vow had not died. It had simply passed on, carried now in every heart that believed. In the years that followed, the story spread farther than the plains. Travelers carried it across mountains and rivers, telling of the rancher's son who spoke with heaven in his voice, who healed the broken, who gave his life so others might find hope. Generations repeated the vow without even knowing its origin. Love is stronger than fear. Life is stronger than death. The oak stood tall, a living monument. Families came to sit beneath it, to carve their prayers into its bark, to whisper their griefs into its roots. Children played in its shade, unaware of the blood that had once consecrated the ground. And when storms came, the tree never broke. It stood firm, branches outstretched as though still sheltering the promise spoken long ago. The drifter grew old, his back bent, his hair white. But he remained on the ranch, tending the land with quiet devotion. Each evening, he walked to the oak, laying his hand upon its trunk. He no longer asked questions. He simply whispered thanks, for the son he had been given, for the vow that had outlived them all, for the love that even death could not silence. And when at last his own time came, he lay beneath the branches with his wife's hand in his, the sound of wind moving through the leaves above him. His final words were simple, steady, and full of peace. It was worth it. The vow lived on. It lived in the ranch, in the land, in the children who laughed beneath the oak. It lived in the stories told by firelight, in the songs sung on lonely trails, in the whispered prayers of those who carried burdens too heavy to bear alone. And it would live on until the end of time, because love, once planted, cannot die. I will have your baby. The words no longer belong to one woman, or one child, or one rancher's home. They belong to the world. They belong to eternity. And so the story was complete, yet never ended. For the vow still echoed on the wind, and always would. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.